G'day and welcome. My name is James. I'm one of the ministers in the All Saints Network, a network of Anglican churches in the north of Tasmania. A kingdom without a king. I think Mark Sayers, preacher in Melbourne at Red Church, coined the phrase to describe how people in the West today want to live. We want to live and mine and take hold of many of the values that come from the Judeo-Christian tradition, but we want to do that without acknowledging and understanding that there's a king behind this kingdom, the King of Jesus. And so I've titled this little series, Rescuing God. Does God need rescuing? No, he does not. But often in our day and age, particularly here in Australia in the 21st century, perhaps it's true in the US, the UK, much of Europe, it would appear that God is dead. And certainly that's been trumpeted for decades, hasn't it? And particularly in the early 2000s with the rise of new atheism, you had the God delusion and the idea of God was challenged again. And here we are, 20 or so years later, still large swaths of the population of humanity wrestling with the question of God, believing in God, expressing a faith in God. But if you live in the modern West and you look around, it would appear, on the surface at least, that God is dead, that there's no king in the kingdom, that God needs rescuing in somehow. And so what I want to do, I want to invite you to join with me just to explore and unpack what it looks like to be the church in the 21st century modern West, how we got to where we are from a cultural perspective, and what the church can do to recover, in a sense, its identity and live out the way in which I think God would call the church to live and express and reflect the true nature of God. So you could argue that God might appear dead or that God needs rescuing because you train that lens on the church that's meant to be the mirror, that's meant to reflect who God is. And much of what you see in the church in Australia and the US and places like that is scandal, is churches hitting the headlines because they've misused money. It's all kinds of things. Even in the tradition I'm in the Anglican church here in Australia, we've had a really difficult season over the last number of years, owning up to the fact that the church for decades perpetrated great evil as through sexual abuse of minors, and that's truly evil, truly terrible thing. And so the church looks lost. The church looks like it's been beat up and bruised and thrown on the trash heap because we've acted in ways that don't reflect the heart of God. And you look at the church and think, well, if that's what the church is like, what must God be like? So what I want to do is take these episodes, to kind of recover a little bit who the church is and what we're meant to be, how we understand and operate in the world that we live in, and in some senses, hopefully then reflect the King, who doesn't need rescuing, but perhaps needs repositioning in our hearts and minds. So there's a few things that I want to do just to kick us off. Firstly, I wanted to share with you an image that I had, a vision, if you will, of what these kind of talks represent. Imagine, if you will, a beautiful ring, and in that ring is set a precious stone. I'm married to Karen, and 16 years ago, when we got engaged, my job was to organise a ring. I had very little to do in the whole process of getting married. Organising a ring was one thing, and so I took that to heart. I'm not a very creative person from an artistic perspective. I'm a terrible drawer. I think I failed art in high school. It was certainly up there in my worst subjects. And so anyway, when the time came to pick a ring, I'd made the courageous decision to design a ring from scratch. So I went and located a diamond. I bought the diamond individually, and it's not, by today's standards, it's not particularly huge, but it was all I could afford. And then I found a jeweler and I said, here's the design that I'd like. And the jeweler went and made it. And I remember picking it up and looking at it, and it's an unusual design. And Karen is let's just say she has a timeless classical elegance and beauty, in case she ever watches this. And I remember picking up the ring and hopping on the train and heading home, and I was holding it, and I was terrified on two counts. One, was she going to like it? And I think I asked every second person on the train what they thought. Clearly, I was asking for a mugging or something, but people assured me, no, she'll love it. It's going to be great. And the other thing that I couldn't get over was just how tiny these claws on the ring were that were holding this stone in place. It looked like at the first bump, at the slightest knock, this diamond was going to be dislodged and disappear. And that was a concern actually that I shared with Karen when I finally put that ring on her finger and she said yes. I remember, the first time she was doing hands in the sink and she knocked it against the tap and it was this alert, is it still there? And the first time that you bump it and look down and has it been dislodged, how tightly is this thing secure? How secure is it? Because it doesn't look secure. In some senses, when I think of the church, when I think of how the church is described in the Bible, and when I think about what it looks like, I envisage it as a precious gem, like a diamond, brilliant, reflecting light incredibly, and ultimately reflecting the light and glory of God. But in some senses, I think the capital C church of the modern West, I think needs to be reset. Like clay being shaped by the potter, I think the church needs to be reset on its sure foundation on Jesus Christ, because it has been dislodged. It appears, at least on the surface, that much of the church has lost its way. I think it would be fair to say that more often we are culturally indistinct. We've been profoundly shaped by the secular age in which we live. And I think for many of us, I think of this for myself, even as we continue to believe and trust and follow Jesus. When Jesus says in Matthew 5, you are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world. It feels like, I'm not particularly salty. I'm not reflecting that light particularly well. You might see some of yourself, like I will, in some of the things we explore. You might see your church in some of this, but I'm not specifically speaking about your church. I'm not specifically speaking about my church. I'm not talking about the global church. I'm really talking about the modern Western church within the Western cultural context of hyper-expressive individualism. So that's the broader setting, the broader context in which you and I live, in which our churches worship and minister. And I think this has a profound impact on who we are and on what we do, even as followers of Jesus, as the body of Christ, as the church. And so, as I said, what I want to do over the next 7 or 8 episodes is take us on a bit of a journey. There's an arc, there's a direction in which we're headed, and over the next episode or two, what I want to do is set the foundation. I'm going to try and explain or talk through or commentate on how 21st century Australians see and understand themselves in the world, and that includes you and me. So if you're a Christian watching this, I'm talking about all people, irrespective of faith or background. If you say I'm an Aussie, if you grow up in Aussie culture, then you're shaped by this culture. And I think we're profoundly impacted by it. And we're going to talk about what David Williams and a few others have described as a pain-pleasure worldview, which is a construct, a way in which we see and understand the world that's come out of living in what is called a secular age. Now that's a bit of a mouthful, but it's also a sign of things to come. And then what I want to do after that, probably in episodes 3 and 4, is unpack a gospel paradigm, a paradigm that's revealed in the Bible that I think helpfully allows us to understand what's really going on in the world. And it's based on how Jesus viewed the world and how he modeled life and lived in the world. What you might call a suffering glory worldview. That's a parallel model. We're going to unpack it as a reality that's very close in some respects to the culture in which we live. And I think the broader Australian culture, the broader Western world, needs those of us who are followers of Jesus to recapture and to understand what it means to live out of a gospel paradigm, to live out as Jesus' apprentices, to live in the same way he did, to take on this suffering glory worldview, because that's going to really impact our practice. It's going to really impact how we live. It's actually going to be the lens by which we journey through to make a difference in how we live. So that's kind of the arc. That's the direction that we're headed. So we live in what has been called a secular age. Okay, so in 2007, Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor wrote what I think has become the seminal work describing secularism. And I since 2007, it's really the foundational piece of writing. You'll see it's called A Secular Age. You may have read it. It's about 900 or so pages long. I'll be not quite. I overextended there. It's about 800 pages long, with about 60 pages of footnotes. I'll be honest, this is probably the hardest book I've ever read. It took me a very long time, and I think, if I'm generous, I understood about that much. So I went back and read it, different parts of it again. It was very slow going. My nightly reading, I was proud of myself if I could get through like 3 or 4 pages. Okay, I'm not a super smart guy. This was really tough to engage with. But after that, a lot of people have written books to try and unpack his philosophical brilliance, so that if you're not an A-grade philosopher, you've still got a hope at trying to understand what he's talking about. So probably the best example of that was James K. Smith's How Not to Be Secular. I don't know if you can see that. That was a much easier read. That didn't take me about a year, and can thoroughly recommend it. Really helpful. And what I'm going to share over these episodes really is what could only be described as a gross simplification of these ideas. Just enough to give you a taste. If you want to go further, and I'm sure many of you have, go right ahead. I want to give us a bit of a framework so that we can actually explore how it is the church might be a part of rescuing God, might be a part of reinstating a framework where the idea of a king within a kingdom makes sense. So there's a couple of really important disclaimers that I need to make. Firstly, I'm not trying to be original, okay? I'm not claiming to be original. A lot of what I'm going to say is really commentating, if you will, on what's been said. I'm not trying to make anything out of this in terms of my name or money or myself. You know, if anything, let me just be the armchair conversationalist as we look at the people who have thought about this, understand it, much more brilliant than I am. I've already referenced Charles Taylor, James Smith. I've mentioned David Williams. The other two are perhaps names of international renown. David Williams is a brilliant missiological thinker and theologian, lesser known perhaps outside of Australia. He's got lots of really helpful articles that we're going to kind of work through a bit here, some online talks and things. They'll be in the links as this goes out, right? So I'm not trying to capitalize on any of these guys. I'm just trying to explore it. So if I miss a reference here or there, I apologize. We'll do what we can to make sure that that doesn't happen. I think in one of his online talks, and James K. Smith has a few online talks. They're really interesting, some more so than others. But in one of his talks, it may even have been a talk in which he was talking through his book, How Not to Be Secular. He describes himself, I think, as a dinghy riding in the wake of a massive ocean cruiser. The ocean cruiser being, Charles Taylor in terms of depth and breadth of philosophical insight. So let me just say, if Charles Taylor is the massive cruise ship and James Smith is the dinghy, then James Hornby, I am the barnacle clinging on to the underside of the dinghy, right? And that's being generous. So going to reference lots of people, talk through it. There's cultural commentators in Australia, people like Stephen McAlpine, Murray Campbell and others. I'm sure they'll get a reference. And we will put, where we can, those references in the descriptions below. So that's my massive disclaimer. I'm not trying to be original. I'm only trying to be helpful. Because for a long time, this stuff really confused me. Perhaps it still does. But I think it's really important as a Christian to try and understand it, to try and make sense of the world that we live in, to explain how Christianity fits into the context of the modern West and therefore how we can engage with people in the marketplace of ideas, that faith and trust in Jesus is actually a really beautiful, rational way of thinking, as well as a beautiful, profoundly meaningful way of living that leads to great flourishing. So me trying to explain to you, which, again, it's not so much me talking at you, me kind of engaging with these ideas, trying to explain, at least philosophically, the world we live in, is kind of like a fish trying to explain water to another fish, right? You and I are both fish and we're in the water. We're both completely immersed in this. We're so permeated by it that it's actually virtually impossible to objectively describe it. It's why that's often the realm of philosophers who write massive tomes of books where they invent language, and it's really hard to grasp, partly because we're so immersed in this. It's the air we breathe, it's the water we drink. We're fish trying to explain water. So in order to do that, you need a reference point. You need something that you can compare your current condition with in order to make sense of it. And that's actually what Charles Taylor does in his book, Secular Age. So his book really is an unpacking of a question. I think I've got this right. He says, effectively, why is it that roughly 500 years ago, belief in God, belief in the idea of a deity, belief in the idea of God was virtually unchallenged? And the fact that it was unchallenged was also problematic, right? No one was getting their knickers in and not really about this. It was just accepted. It was the norm. It was the way, the idea of God was like your breathing and eating and living water. It was just there. So it was, in other words, it was virtually impossible 500 years ago to imagine not believing in God. Just like, think about that for a second, right? Can you imagine a world where it's virtually impossible to even conceive that God might not exist? I was trying to think about that, and it actually made me think of it's an old movie now because, I'm in my mid-40s, but an old movie by Ricky Gervais called The Invention of Lying. You may have seen the film. It's a movie which sets up an alternate reality, right? Where it's a world where lying doesn't exist. It's impossible for people to conceive of what a lie is. Clearly not of this world, right? My kids, they didn't need to be taught how to lie. It came pretty easily. I think they got it from their father, but I've worked on that. So this movie is this alternate reality where it's impossible to conceive of lying because everybody just tells the truth. So you don't ask the question, right? Do I look fat in this? That question's off the table. So Ricky Gervais in the movie, he discovers lying. He discovers that actually you can say something that isn't true. And it's impossible for people to think that he might not be telling the truth. So he could say anything and they just accepted it as truth. Oh, okay then, sure. I think one scene he walks into the teller at the bank and he's broke and he basically says, I've got 20,000 in the bank or something like that. And they said, no, you don't. He says, yes, I do. That must be a banking error. And they went, it's impossible, inconceivable that someone could tell a lie. Well, so our systems must not be working properly. And he walks out with this big bag of cash. So try and contrast a world where it's virtually impossible to conceive of God not existing to today's present existence where it's virtually impossible to conceive of a world where God does exist. It's virtually impossible to imagine believing in God, right? For so many people, that's even the idea of believing in God is hard to grasp. Well, Charles Taylor's book, that 850-page book, tells the story of how we moved from one world to the other, how we moved from this world of Christendom, where it was virtually impossible to conceive that God may not exist, to what he calls, I think, the age of authenticity, in which it's effectively this age that we live in is now a world that's exemplified by the idea that every individual needs to find some form of authentic self-expression. And we live, as a result of that, in a world where it's impossible to even conceive of the idea of God for many people. So to explain how we got there, he basically unpacks this word secular and how the word itself has actually changed meaning over time. And our words do that. The way we use words change over time. Because you might be watching this and thinking, this is fantastic, that's really good. And you might even say that. But 20 years ago, you might have said, oh, man, that was fully sick. All right. The way we use words change, meaning changes. Some of those changes, thank goodness, don't last. And as a society and culture, we grow out of them. But over time, how we use words changes. So he unpacks how this word secular has changed over time. And because he's a philosopher, he actually calls these secular 1, secular 2, and secular 3. I think it's in the first chapter of his book. My goodness, trying to track that, it took me a while to work out what was going on because we were going from secular 1 to secular 2 to secular 3 and backing around. But he's got basically what he's doing is tracking how this word, how the meaning of the word has shifted. It's pretty hard work, I think, but I think it's worth at least taking a stab at it, right? So when he talks about secular 1, just from a chronological perspective, he takes us back to 1500, right? 500 years ago, early 1500s, before the Reformation. And in that, back then in the 1500s, the world was basically split into two spheres, right? The heavenly sphere, or what you might call the sacred sphere, and then the sphere of everyday life, the secular sphere. And so if you we're in the secular sphere was where all the everyday, ordinary work of life and play happened, right? So if you're a cobbler or a maid or a blacksmith, whoever, you did your work and you existed in this ordinary, everyday plane of existence. But for a few select people, the priests, the nuns, often the composers of the day, they existed, the artists, they existed in the sacred sphere of life. They were the ones that dealt with the God stuff, engaged with the sacred. So effectively, the world was divided between ordinary stuff and God stuff. And some special people did the God stuff, and so they inhabited that. But the rest of us, we were just in the ordinary, everyday kind of sphere of life. The secular sphere. So it's just a way of thinking about that split. Then later, this word secular shifted. And so what he describes as secular too is often what we think of now of the word secular. We think of it as this idea of being unbiased or objective. It's set apart from religion. You've got your religious stuff, and then you've got your rational stuff. So it's not sacred and everyday. It's religious and rational, right? The implication being, of course, that religious is no longer objective and rational, observable. That's the realm of the secular. And that starts to play itself out in universities and educational systems and things like that. It's kind of the exclusion of religion or religious thinking from the public square. So a really good example of that last year was Andrew Thornton was installed as the CEO of a footy club, an Australian rules footy club, and there was a big brouhaha because it turned out he was also he was the chair on the board of a church, right? And so, oh my goodness, the religious stuff, that can't mix with the rational, objective stuff. So if he's there and he's here, somehow he's compromised. Okay, you can check out the articles. There was some good stuff was written about it. Very interesting to see just how this played itself out. So in the public square, there's no room for the religious because we want to be people that are objective and rational. That's sort of what Charles Taylor talks about as secular too. And that's how most of us would still probably inherently gravitate towards as an understanding of what secular means. So this idea of secular too is also the idea that human flourishing no longer requires God, right? That we can make ourselves. That this is our progress and our evolution, our growth is attributed to us and the belief that we can do it, right? We don't need God anymore. But the third meaning of secular, which is the focus of his book, is really around the idea of the conditions, the undercurrents, the shifting of the really deep ways of looking at the world and understanding the world that happened really slowly over time. How those things have moved in such a way that beliefs can be contested. Okay, so it's not even a question of belief and unbelief. What's become normal is the questioning of belief, the contesting it. Because what is considered believable or unbelievable has changed over time. They're like the pillars that undergird the structure or the currents that keep things afloat. They've changed over time, And so I think the philosophical term was plausibility structures. So what's considered even plausible, it has shifted. So when what's considered plausible changes, then the idea of belief becomes something that can be contested. Now, this is not just the belief of God or the particular beliefs of Christianity. It means every belief, every idea, everything in the marketplace can be contested, right? Nobody hears something anymore and goes, "Oh, that seems good. I'll just believe it." No, every idea is challenged. So he's not saying this is a bad thing, by the way. This isn't necessarily morally good or bad. He's just trying to explain what's happened. So the things that are considered believable have over a long time shifted. And so what was once believable is no longer believable, and every possible belief is something that can be challenged and worked through. So I think it's really important to understand, particularly from Charles Taylor, that when he speaks about secular, he's not speaking about the opposite of faith, right? So he's not speaking about this dichotomy or this separation. You've got secular and faith, just like you've got rational and objective and religious, right? He's just simply talking about the fact that that you can't take a belief in society or belief in a culture as a default anymore. There's no default when it comes to belief. So that's where we're going to leave it. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time.